We're going to begin with panel 2. What I'd like to do here, and hope we can delve into a little bit of the medical and legal and academic issues surrounding concussions. Let me introduce the panel and then have them talk about their specialties as we sort of continue to drill down. To my right is Marc Edelman, Associate Professor of Law at Barry University, one of the leading scholars on this issue, and he will explain some of the impressive work he's doing, especially with regarding amateur athletics, specifically the NCAA. To my left is Dr. Mike Marino. He is with the Moss Rehab Center, has researched and done a lot of work with brain injury, and he will be our medical expert, and I know a lot of people have questions about diagnosis, treatment, return to play issues. And to my far left is Cailyn Reilly, who's a student here at Villanova Law School, who has not only had experience with concussions, but has written a very impressive article at UCLA Law Journal, which she'll talk about as well. So we'll start with Marc.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here. As Professor Brandt mentioned, my full-time line of work is as a professor of law, but my expertise is in sport. And to write on any issue involving a given industry, it's important to first really understand the history and the background of the industry. One thing I learned was, while the issue of concussions in sport have really been spoken about over the past 5 years, head injuries in sport, and particularly head injuries in football, this is not a new issue. We could turn back over 100 years. In 1906, by a show of hands, how many people here are familiar with the NCAA as an organization? Of course we are. We think about them as being the organization that purportedly protects amateurism or ensures profit for an association. Well, the NCAA was founded in 1906 at the request of President Theodore Roosevelt, primarily for the purpose of minimizing head and neck injuries in football. At the point in time, there was already a widespread concern about this growing game of college football, and mind you, in 1906, there was no professional game. There was concern that the sport was too dangerous, and head and neck injuries led to 11 deaths, severe concussions, and neck problems for a whole host of players. The NCAA in its early days really was exactly what they purported to be, an organization that existed to protect the interests of the athletes. And in the early years, they took a few steps to make the game of football safer. For example, these are plays that you've never seen, but in the early days of football, players used to grab hands and attach themselves to each other to prevent players from being tackled. What this actually created, though, was a situation where as the players got tackled, they all fell on each other, leading to severe head and neck damage. Another play, and Mr. Westbrook could be thankful as a running back that was no longer part of the books, was known as the Flying Squirrel. The Flying Squirrel was a college football play, I believe used primarily on a 3rd and 1, 4th and 1 situation, where the running back would be lifted up by the offensive lineman and then hurled over the defensive line on the other side to get a first down. The NCAA, however, again said that this was too dangerous, this was causing severe neck damage, and led to the end of that play. For the period of time right through the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s, the NCAA did just that. They were the leading organization for keeping football safe, and as they learned about problems in the game, they worked to protect head injuries in sport. Again, there was no such thing as the NFL until the year 1920. And in the early years of the NFL, the league did not have the reputation it did today. In fact, in 1926, Red Grange, the Galloping Ghost, when he went to enter the NFL, he was talked out of it by his coach, by the head of Big Ten football, and by his father. At the time, football was seen to be, on a professional level, a game of disrepute. But of course, that's changed. The NFL has become big business, extremely profitable, in part through their media contracts. And by the 1950s, the NCAA had recognized that professional sport was big business. So while they continued to purport to be amateur, the NCAA at that point shifted a lot of its focus into broadcasting rights and making profits as well. detracting attention that they once placed on protecting the game from head injuries. Now, today, it's created an unusual situation because in the sport of boxing, Congress stepped in the year 2000. In the year 2000, Congress said that the sport of boxing has too great a risk of head injuries and passed the Muhammad Ali Act. One of the requirements of the Muhammad Ali Act was entirely to separate the role of league ownership, or which would be known as the managers, and the boxers and their promoters. The Muhammad Ali Act, as a matter of federal law, has required there to be outside doctors that oversee the boxing events and totally separated the interest of the athlete from the interest of those who profited from the event. But we don't have that in football. We don't have that in professional football, perhaps because Congress feels that the collective bargaining agreement between the teams and the Players Association sufficiently protect players' rights. And as to why we don't have that in collegiate sport, well, I'll leave it to you to make your own assessment about how college sports are treated and governed in this country, but the time seems to be overdue, especially since one could question whether the NCAA really today serves primarily for the purposes that it was created, to protect athletes, especially football players, for head injuries, or whether the interests of the association are no longer aligned with those of the athletes itself. But these are issues we'll have to look at, whether the federal government should get involved, or whether the lawsuits that will be spoken about later today will be playing an ample role in creating change, thus that we don't need federal law.
Dr. Marino, I'll give you a wide berth here to talk about diagnosis, treatment, return to play issues.
Yeah, I could use a wide berth. First of all, I'm very happy that this event is going on so that we can really raise awareness of all of these issues. And at the same time that I'm happy that this event is going on, I am totally and completely disheartened at the stories of the gentlemen who are up here before us. My role as a physician is to protect my patients and their brains and their heads. And unfortunately, too often in the past and even ongoing now, that's not happening. I could address those issues that those players brought up, and I could talk for 2 hours, but there's no time for that. So I'm going to try to hit the highlights, and hopefully there'll be time for questions as well. If there's 2 points that I want everybody to take away from this today, the 2 main things I want people to know are that concussions happen in every single sport. It doesn't matter if it's a contact sport, a non-contact sport, a team sport, an individual sport. They happen to all athletes of all ages and all levels, whether it's amateur, semi-pro, or pro. And they happen, of course, outside of the sporting arena as well. But no athlete is immune from the risks of concussion. The other thing that I want everyone to know is that every case should be treated individually, and how one person responds and how one player responds will be very different from any other person. And while there are some overlying guidelines and concepts that dictate our treatment, every single case should be handled individually and thought of as unique. What is a concussion? I think that's something that people really struggle with. And I think people also get frightened when they hear the term traumatic brain injury, because that's really what a concussion is. It's a trauma to the brain. So there is force that is applied to the brain. It can be applied to the body or to another part of the neck and then transmitted up to the brain. And it results in a functional injury, not a structural injury. And this is something that people also have a really hard time understanding, because our conventional methods of measuring brain injuries with CAT scans and MRIs, which are going to show skull fractures and areas of bleeding and elevated, swelling within the brain, we don't see that in concussion. And that's because the injury itself is at truly a microscopic level. But it's a microscopic level affecting hundreds of thousands or millions of neurons in the brain. Without going too much into the gory details, what happens is there's a force applied to the brain. There is a stretch force applied to the neuron, which is each of the individual brain cells. When the neuron is stretched, some of the charged particles that are supposed to stay outside the cell go inside the cell, and it sets off a cascade of events that leads to damage to the cell's energy-making capabilities. So in essence, a concussion is an energy crisis of the cell. The brain cell cannot come up with enough energy to do its job correctly. So whenever you then task this cell, whenever you ask your brain to work or to think, it can't meet up with the demands, and it results in the symptoms that people experience with a concussion. And exercise and thinking and using your brain, these are the demands of the brain, which is why athletes and patients with concussions are told to rest. I'll briefly touch on the signs and symptoms of concussion. I think that this is a very well-educated group, in fact. But all too often, these signs of concussion are missed or overlooked. If you're waiting to see a loss of consciousness at the time of an injury, you're going to miss more than 90% of sports-related concussions, because 10% or less of sports-related concussions result in loss of consciousness. So instead, what we should be looking for is these kind of transient alterations in brain function. Confusion, loss of memory, athletes who are unsure of their assignment, that look like they're in a daze or a fog. They don't know what's going on in the game. They don't know the time, what half it is, who they're playing, what the score is. They, of course, could get a headache. They don't look as coordinated as they did. They appear that their balance is off. They can have some changes in their vision. They may feel nauseous. Or, alternatively, it could be they see stars for a second, and then it goes away. That could be a concussion. It could be that they, quote-unquote, got their bell rung, and you see that all the time. The guy kind of stands there for a second, shakes his head, and then, he says, no, I'm fine. That player should be identified, pulled to the side of the field, and evaluated by a trained professional. And there's a variety of sideline tools. One in particular is recommended. It's called the SCAT-3, or the Sideline Concussion Evaluation, or Assessment Test, rather. And that's a tool to help to identify an injured player who should then be removed from play and evaluated by a professional. That's what happens at the time of injury, and then people go on to develop a spectrum of symptoms that can include headaches, difficulty sleeping, changes in vision, nausea, again, changes in balance, mood changes, irritability, depression, disordered sleep cycles, feeling tired all of the time, and really having a difficult time concentrating and thinking. People say, when I use my brain, when I try to think, I feel like I have to work that much harder to do things that were easier before. These are all signs of an active and ongoing concussion. These are symptoms that need to be monitored for their resolution. So once someone is identified, what do we do with them? Well, the main prescription is rest, and it's cognitive rest and physical rest. Physical rest people get, okay, don't run, don't jog, don't exercise, don't go swimming. You may not even want to go out too much for long walks. Pretty much hang out around the house and don't exert yourself at all. People understand that. It's the cognitive rest that people have a lot more difficulty with. No TV, no texting, no cell phones, no computers, no schoolwork, no homework, no work of any kind. Limit time doing TV, limit even times, reading magazines. It's got to be as close to sit in a dark room and do nothing for as long as possible. It's not possible to do, but I tell my patients the closer they can come to doing that, we believe that the faster they will recover. And how do we determine when someone is recovered? Because this is going to factor in on their return to play or their return to activity levels. Well, they should have full neurologic evaluation, and that should be asymptomatic, should be completely normal. They should have no symptoms at rest whatsoever. If baseline neuropsychological testing is available, it is a fantastic tool. These are things like impact testing that maybe some of you have heard about. It is just that, it is a tool. It is not the end-all be-all. It is not the only thing that is used to determine if someone has recovered. But when it's available and when used correctly, it is an excellent tool that a clinician will use to help determine if a patient has recovered to their baseline. Once they've completed resting, they're asymptomatic, they've returned to school or work, and they're not having any of their symptoms, their neurologic exam is normal, their baseline testing, their testing has returned to baseline, and they're not on any medications that could interfere or mask some of the symptoms, then that would be a time to consider return to play. There's a host of other factors that go into that, including age, possibly gender, how many concussions they've had in the past, and that's why I say it's a very individual decision. But once you reach the decision that somebody is ready, then they should undergo a graded return to play process through a professional. Best case scenario would be an athletic trainer. And you guys have probably heard about some of this, about working with athletic trainers, particularly in the NFL and their athletes and the stages that they go through, which includes, the first stage is all rest, and then it's going to be light exercise, and then sports specific training, and then sports-specific training with drills, so that would be dribbling or throwing or using a puck in hockey, and then it would go on to full contact practice and then full contact game. All of the time they're being evaluated for return of symptoms. If at any point they have a return of symptoms, then exercise is stopped, they're told to rest for a day, and then they will return to this protocol the next day, but just at a lower level. And each of those steps takes place over the course of one day. So 1 day rest, the next day would be light exercise, the next day would be moderate exercise, and so on. Now, I tell all of my patients that I anticipate that they will have a full neurologic recovery, and that the goal would be to return them to their normal activities and hopefully to their sport. Unfortunately, the gentleman that we saw before us, these individuals have not had a full neurologic recovery. And I'm not sure if we'll have time during my talk, because I want to give Cailyn enough time to talk, but with each successive concussive injury, typically the recovery time becomes longer and longer. The amount of trauma needed to the brain to induce a concussion gets lower and lower, and the risks of permanent neurological sequelae increase. The magic number is 3. It's not to say that everybody has three concussions isn't going to recover, but evidence tells us that once you reach that 3rd concussion level, the chances of you having permanent, long-lasting symptoms greatly increases. And that's information you want to use to determine if return to play is really advisable or not. The last thing I want to say is that there is a difference between permanent neurologic sequelae from multiple repeated traumatic brain injuries and this entity called chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So chronic traumatic encephalopathy is a distinct pathologic entity in which there's abnormal protein that is released into the brain that causes atrophy or loss of brain tissue. It can only be diagnosed by a biopsy, which means you have to take a piece of brain, so it's not done until someone has died. But there is a spectrum of symptoms that includes depression, loss of interest, irritability, problems with memory, and we don't know how many injuries, how many concussions it takes for someone to develop this. It's very difficult to diagnose, and it should be a diagnosis of exclusion, meaning you need to work up other issues before you tell someone they have chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So it's very difficult to determine if somebody's having just issues with mood or memory that is related to multiple concussions or this distinct pathologic injury. But anybody who's experiencing these signs should be seen and evaluated by a trained professional and had a full neurologic workup. There's a lot more that I'd like to say, but I'm gonna step aside so Cailyn has plenty of time, and if there are more questions, hopefully we can answer them afterwards.
Thanks, Doctor. Very informative. Cailyn, as I mentioned, a student here at Villanova Law School.
Thank you. And I noticed that that's all the program says about me, but I did write an article on concussion problems in the NCAA. I brought some copies with me. I published it in the UCLA Entertainment Law Review. And after the symposium, I think Mr. Moorad's going to sign baseballs, Mr. Westbrook's going to sign footballs, and I'd be happy to send you home with a signed copy. Don't tell them I said they were going to be signing anything after this. In my paper, I argued for many of the things that you all heard the first panel talk about. I argued that the NCAA needs to implement a nationwide specific concussion management protocol, an education program for student athletes, coaches, athletic trainers, professors, and advisors, and for a bright line rule for when it's appropriate, if ever, for an athlete that suffered brain injury to return to play. But I think that the main reason that I was asked to sit on this illustrious panel here is because of my personal experience with concussions and my brother's personal experience with concussions. We all played Division I sports and had some experience. And in researching for the article that I wrote, I talked to a lot of people who had similar experiences. And just this week, I spoke to one of my former coaches who reminded me of her son's experience. And that story kind of captured some of the most salient points, I think, from all the stories that I heard in the 2 years that I was working on this paper. So what happened there was, I remember her son well. He was an all-star athlete in high school. He was honor roll, president of his class. He was really going places, went to a top school and applied for and got into one of the most competitive academic programs in that school. He also played lacrosse. And you heard Taylor earlier say, you know, it's not just football, it's soccer, it's lacrosse, it's not just boys sports, it's girls sports also. And he did really well. He was a huge contributor on the team. And then one spring, he suffered a series of 3 concussions in a 4-week period. You just heard Dr. Marino say that's kind of the magic number. But these concussions went undetected and unreported until he got the 3rd one. And it knocked him out. It was a hit from a guy who was 50 pounds lighter than he was and relatively light. It was just practice, but it knocked him out. So at that point, he really couldn't hide that he had been suffering concussions and symptoms of concussions. So he came out of practice. The trainer told him to rest, said he wouldn't go back for a little while. And he did that, he didn't go into practice, but he was still expected to show up at afternoon practices and stand under the lights for 3 hours every day. He was still expected to go to the morning lifts and morning workouts. So, he was kind of doing the opposite of what you, again, just heard Dr. Marino say is the prescription for people suffering symptoms of concussions. He was also still trying to keep up with his schoolwork. Remember, he was in a really competitive academic program. And it was hard for him to do. He really struggled, and eventually it reached the point where he just kind of ceased functioning academically. Again, it's a functional injury. At that point, he decided to take a year off from school, went home and rested and recovered, and or so it seemed, I guess. He went back to school the next year, re-enrolled in the academic program, and he was also able to walk back onto the lacrosse team. So I think that's a huge problem there, but there was nothing that anyone could do to stop him from doing that. There was no rule that said once you've taken an academic leave of absence because of suffering head injuries, you shouldn't go back to play. There was nothing that any of the doctors or my coach's parent could do to stop him from going back, and the coaches weren't helpful. He was a huge contributor. They wanted him to go back and play. So he did, risking near certain further brain injury. And it wasn't very easy for him to go back. He lost interest in playing his sport. He had been a huge contributor, and he was moved to the practice squad. He struggled academically. He had to withdraw from the program that he was in, changed his major. It was really hard for him. And based on other stories that I've heard and my experience, I know, and what we just heard this morning in the first panel, these things aren't unique to that situation. Lots of athletes feel this way. Lots of people struggle like that. And that's kind of the reason that I wrote the paper, for those kinds of athletes. And again, the NCAA says that there should be a concussion management protocol for each team, but it goes no further than that. I think that there needs to be a very specific protocol that's uniform amongst all schools so that student athletes realize or can expect that they're going to receive the same treatment after they suffer a brain injury, whether they're at the University of Maryland or at UCLA. You heard the first panel say, this is also about education. It's not the huge knockout hits that do the most damage. It's the multiple subconcussive hits that over time and throughout an athlete's career are the most damaging and the ones that go undetected. So ultimately, it's got to be the athlete who realizes that, these are all the problems that I may face later on down the road, and it's not worth 2 more years of a collegiate athletic career when I'm facing potential problems for the rest of my life. And lastly, there needs to be a bright line rule. I know Taylor said that it's difficult to kind of draw the line where enough is enough and an athlete can't ever return to play, but certainly in this case where the athlete had to withdraw from school for a year because of what his sport had done to him, to his functioning, there's no way he should have gone back.
Thanks, Cailyn. And these stories are heartfelt and emotional, and I just want to say when we announced this symposium, I've got literally a dozen emails similar to this story. People just want to express what they've gone through, what their kids are going through, what their family members are going through. Professor Edelman, listening to all these, and of course we're going to talk about the NFL case next, but duty of care, NCAA, amateur organizations, other sports, what is the responsibility of these leagues, of these teams, of these coaches, of these trainers to prevent situations like this?
Frankly, I believe the duty of care is extremely different for the NCAA than it would be for the NFL. And for people that are following the NFL litigation, which I know will be spoken about in a lot more detail on the next panel, if the NFL might have problems with respect to the NCAA, we haven't seen anything yet. Torts generally talks about the duty of care, the obligation that one party has onto another, as being a situational obligation, meaning that the duty of care is not identical for every party, but certain behaviors and actions that you take could create a heightened or increased duty of care. The NFL's relationship with its players is one as employer. And I believe the next panel will discuss there might be certain contexts with respect to the NFL that could elevate their duty of care, such as the access to certain information. But if we look at the way the NFL operates today, since the late 1960s, I believe 1968 to be exact, the NFL players have been unionized. And absent a couple of short periods of time where the Players Association has decertified, the union has bargained on behalf of the players with respect to hours, wages, and working conditions. That doesn't mean by any stretch that the NFL does not have a duty of care to the players, but the NFL's duty of care would be similar to that of another employer in a unionized industry. With respect to the NCAA, however, we're talking apples and oranges. All you need to do is go to the NCAA's own webpage and look at their history, and they will say, first, that they're a body that exists to protect the safety of student athletes, and second, the story which I told before about Theodore Roosevelt encouraging the creation of the NCAA for purposes of preventing head injuries, that's on the NCAA's very own website. Now, by purporting that they're an organization that exists to protect student athletes for head injuries, in my opinion, they create a great duty to protect student athletes from head injuries. It's true the NCAA has changed its role since 1953, since when they elected Walter Beyer as their first executive director. And the way we look at the NCAA today, we might say first and foremost they're about whatever the NCAA calls amateurism. And second, that they're about, frankly, making profits internally for the institution and for top coaches. But by taking on that obligation and standing behind that obligation, in many ways it has precluded others from serving in that same role with respect to protecting the student athlete. My opinion is we've reached the point in time where the NCAA has strayed so far from truly protecting the safety of student athletes, and so much of their incentive has become maximizing profits, that we cannot go back the other way, that we need a separate outside party to be determining the health and safety of student athletes. And we've reached the point in time where the obligation is on the NCAA to totally separate itself from that particular role. Because remind yourselves, unlike the professional football players and professional athletes in other sports, where at least the union has the opportunity to bargain on these issues, the NCAA purports we are here to protect student athletes. And thus, by not doing so, it would create a breach.
Dr. Marino, what would you advise leagues, teams, NCAA, amateur associations, we're not talking about professional sports right now, in their duty of care, what would be the adequate level?
I would advise first of all, I am a proponent of baseline neuropsychological testing, and not full spectrum neuropsychological testing, which is a process that takes several hours or sometimes several days to actually do. But what I'm talking about is some of these computer-based tests, which I alluded to before, like IMPACT, which is not the end-all be-all, but is a fantastic tool when utilized correctly. I think that it goes a long way to help to protect athletes. Additionally, I think that each concussed or injured athlete should be identified and evaluated by a trained professional prior to their return to play. And what does that mean? Does that mean, for the NFL, I know you don't want to talk about the professional athletes, but does that mean an independent physician who is not employed by the team? Well, that's probably the best way to go. But for a college athlete, does that mean somebody other than the campus-based sports medicine doctor? I don't think so. I think that the campus-based sports medicine doctors really have the best interest of athletes in mind. But it needs to be somebody who has experience and training in head injuries and concussion. Now, in our state of Pennsylvania, that is mandated to be, it can include neurologists, my specialty, which is physical medicine and rehabilitation, and my fellowship training in brain injury rehabilitation. It can be sports medicine subspecialty trained physicians, or it can be clinical neuropsychologists. The importance is that it needs to be somebody who knows what they're doing and knows what to look for, because as I said before, each case is highly individual, and there is a host of factors that goes into determining whether or not somebody is ready or it's advisable that they should play. And again, it can be age, could be gender, could be history of concussions, it could be their other medical history. Do they have a history of headaches or psychiatric disturbances or attention deficit hyperactivity disorders, or what is their style of play? Are they a particularly aggressive athlete that has been known to frequently get injured? All of these things need to be taken into consideration so that they can be addressed and properly assessed and treated before somebody is allowed to put themselves back out there where we know, they're going to be at risk again no matter what we do.
Cailyn, in your article, you outlined 3 steps you thought the NCAA should take. You want to talk about those?
Sure. Again, the NCAA kind of takes the step of saying schools need to implement concussion management protocol, but goes no further. It's kind of a regulation with no teeth. The NCAA, I think everyone knows, is very good at compliance and making sure that their rules are followed. But in this area, they really haven't done anything, and they've allowed for a really wide range of different kinds of adequate and inadequate kinds of concussion protocols to be implemented by the schools. Again, I think that if the NCAA is going to take the kind of step to say schools need to have a kind of protocol, they need to go a little bit farther and make sure that the protocol is complied with and adequately serves the student athletes. And at the risk of sounding redundant, education is very important. When you're experiencing symptoms, you're the only one that knows that you're experiencing these symptoms. And if you can realize what the long-term potential implications of playing through a concussion are, hopefully you're going to make the right decision and get some help. And then I guess just finally, I'd like to say that, like I said before, the elements of these stories are not unique. They're pretty common throughout all the stories that you've heard today. And I think it's important that people tell their stories and realize that other athletes feel this way, and you can get help and you can help others by telling your stories. So I admire the maturity of the athletes that have come forward and told their stories, and the wisdom, I guess, that they've shown in doing so.
Question, the optimal standard of care, the optimal duty that everyone has sometimes butts up against the issue of money, okay, and resources. And again, when we talk about NFL, when we talk about Major League Sports, they have the resources for numbers of trainers, number of independent doctors. What about not only NCAA amateur sports, but sports that kids and parents here have their children in, don't have the resources to have trainers on the sideline and don't have the resources for independent examinations and baseline? Where's the duty of care there, and where should it be?
If I could take both pieces of the question separately, you first mentioned, Professor Brown, about the NCAA and then about everywhere else. With respect to the NCAA, I don't believe because of the fact they're not quote-unquote professional, it in any way reduces their duty of care. If anything, it should increase it. Just the other day, I happened to have been on the website of the highest paid New York State employees. This was as of 2 years ago. The highest paid professional in the entire SUNY school system was the basketball coach at that school. So without paying their student athletes, there is a huge fund of money which gets allocated internally. Right now, we have basketball coaches and football coaches and athletic directors that make several millions of dollars because that's where the profit goes, so it doesn't look like profit at the end of the day, but it's allocated back. So the reality is if we substantially increase the expenses for the NCAA in terms of care and protection of the student athlete, it likely would be shifted away from these other free ride or additional wealth that they garner based on the fact they don't pay their student athletes. With respect to kids' sports and true amateur sports, it's a much more difficult issue. I certainly believe with more education on the issue, there would be opportunities for those with the medical background who either have children that are playing the sport or who recognize the importance of this in communities where there might be less parents who work in the medical profession to play a role on the sidelines. And ideally, I think if, as these issues come to light and esteem and appreciation is played towards those that really protect against head injuries, ideally people would volunteer their time, at least to their communities, the communities in need, to provide some of these services.
Dr. Marino?
Yeah, that's a common question in healthcare in general when you're talking about resources, and how are we going to utilize our resources best for the greater good? As you mentioned, some sports that don't have the money basically to support whether it be baseline testing or not. The example is if we gave everybody in America, a full body MRI every year, we'd probably find more cancers and be able to treat them sooner, right? But there's no way our health system could afford that, and it would be an improper utilization of our resources. So I think it goes back to the question of, well, is it a proper utilization of our resources to institute baseline testing and independent medical examinations for all of these athletes? And that's certainly a policy level question. And I'm not sure if I'm really appropriately qualified to answer that. Of course, I definitely would again advocate for at least baseline neurologic testing, and it really doesn't cost a district or an institution any money to have somebody seen in an outpatient office by a physician or any clinician trained in concussion care. There's not a great expense that goes into a single office visit or even repeated office visits. So at the very least, if there are not the resources to institute baseline testing, really having every concussed athlete identified and assessed by a professional is really the way to go. And each state varies in its laws regarding what needs to be done. Luckily in Pennsylvania that is the case, but it varies state to state. And is that something that has to come from a state level or from a federal level? I think there's other people here who might be more qualified to answer that question.
On the medical issue, let me follow up with liability. As we're talking about liability from the league and team and amateur association point of view. What about the medical? What about the malpractice issue? Does that, with concussions now being so prevalent in the news, are there worries about over treatment, under treatment, overdiagnosis, those kind of things going on?
I think it doesn't enter my mind, truthfully, when I'm treating patients. I can't speak for all physicians, but I think that the general concept is that you can never be wrong in being overcautious. You can only be wrong if you send an athlete back too soon. And that's why you need to examine the whole picture and take each case individually. Particularly with young athletes, for the most part, parents are happy to go to a doctor and have the doctor say, I don't think you should go back yet. I think that you should continue to rest and we should work on these things. It certainly changes when you move up the spectrum into even collegiate and professional athletics. But I think even at those levels, the only mistake that you can make is to bring somebody back too soon when they're not ready. And if you're acting in good conscience and you are using all of your skills and you're acting to protect a patient, then there is really no liability issue from a medical standpoint.
Final comments, Marc?
I think this is an important step in the right direction. While I've managed probably ad nauseum today that the NCAA since 1906 was supposed to be involved in protecting head injuries in sport, it's only in recent years that we've started having the discussion of concussions and protection and liability and how do we protect the athlete and the student athlete discussed at sports law symposiums. And the ongoing litigations that are taking place by the NFL players against the league, as well as the earlier lawsuits that were filed against the Players Association, I think are critically important, win or lose. Win or lose, irrespective of result, we are finally getting the mass mainstream attention, and not only in law schools, but in the media, about the issue of safety and football. And for the first time, we're having professional athletes and the mainstream public ask the question, is it safe? Would we want our kids playing this sport? And if nothing else, at the end of the day, merely by asking these questions might lead us to making some changes, albeit how minor they may be, in the game, just to make it a little bit more safe moving forward. And if the NCAA has moved away from that mission, it looks like society overall is picking it up. And that's something I think we should feel very good about and very thankful to those people who have been discussing these issues far longer than I have, that have been on many of these panels over recent years.
Thanks, Professor. Doctor?
Thank you. I'll sum up by reiterating the main 2 points that I wanted you guys to take away from this, and that is that concussions and sports-related concussions affect every single athlete at every single level in every single sport. No one is immune to the risk, and I think people have a feeling that some of us folks who are advocating better identification and better treatment, some of us are anti-sport, and that's not the case at all. I'm a huge sports fan, and as are all of the other clinicians I work with who treat these athletes, and we want to see athletes succeed. We want to get them back to playing, but just because somebody is returning to rowing doesn't mean that you can return them sooner if they're not fully recovered than you can if you're returning somebody to be a football quarterback. So again, each case is unique, needs to be treated individually and by a professional who has experience in these matters.
Thanks, Dr. Cailyn.
Thank you. I agree. I'm certainly not up here advocating for the end of contact sports, but I think that there has to be a better way to manage concussions that are inevitable in all sports. And again, I think that the people who are coming forward and sharing their stories and letting athletes who are struggling know that they're really not alone and that there are ways to kind of cope with what's going on and educate other people who are feeling that way. It's very important.
Thanks, Cailyn. Thanks for sharing. And thanks to this informative panel. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And we're going to move right along with our NFL concussion litigation panel.